The Three Musketeers, the most read book in the world after the Bible. Filmed with a cast that dazzles the screen with their brilliant performances.
In the early 1970s, 26-year-old film producer Ilya Salkind, a third-generation international filmmaker, was looking to carry on his family's illustrious legacy and aimed to acquire and adapt established stories for a modern audience. And so it was that after the success of his 1972 thriller Bluebeard, Salkind looked to produce a provocative take on Alexander Dumas' classic adventure, The Three Musketeers. Salkind envisioned the film as an over 3-hour epic, including an old-fashioned intermission, and initially had the ludicrous idea of casting none other than the Beatles themselves, that's John, Paul, George, and Ringo, as the titular characters. The Fab Four's potential involvement led to the hiring of British filmmaker Richard Lester, who at the time was most known for having directed the two Beatles films A Hard Day's Night and Help. While this radical stunt casting fell to the wayside, Lester remained on the project, and Ilya and his legendary father, the French-Polish producer Alexander Salkind, assembled an all-star cast to bring the beloved literary heroes to life, including Oliver Reed, Michael York, Richard Chamberlain, Christopher Lee, Charlton Heston, Faye Dunaway, and Raquel Welch. To further puff up its reputation, Salkind added big Hollywood names behind the camera as well, although Richard Lester would later bemoan that these people were chosen solely for their name recognition, not their qualifications. Lester ran amok with Salkind's lavish vision and aspired to make a 4-hour event film. But as shooting dragged on, it became clear that they would not make their December 1973 release date. Handed an abundance of footage, Alexander Salkind chose to take a page from his own father's producing playbook and deployed a 2-for-1 method of filmmaking, decreeing that the footage was to be split into 2 separate movies, with one released as The Three Musketeers and the other the next year as The Four Musketeers. In other words, he doubled their profit. But this risky and some might say desperate maneuver did not sit well with cast and crew, almost all of whom not only suffered some kind of on-set injury during shooting, but ended up being paid for just one film while the producers cashed in on 2. Therefore, this financial sleight of hand resulted in several lawsuits being flung at the Salkinds, and director Richard Lester would come to view the father and son team as master monetary manipulators. Wizards of cutting corners, one might say. But, as I'll later discuss, their prowess with money most certainly did not play out in the director's favor. Because of tactics that some in the industry viewed as less than ethical, the Screen Actors Guild added what they called the Salkind Clause to all contracts, which prevented studios, producers, or directors from creating new films out of footage from any production without appropriate compensation to the actors. But outside of their legal troubles, both films eventually swashbuckled their way to major box office and critical success, and earned significant awards attention, all of which put Ilya Salkind's career into overdrive. And suddenly, the newborn producer now seemed to have the Midas touch. Salkind said that he was drawn to tales of altruism and larger-than-life heroes because of films his family had produced, namely his grandfather Michael Salkind's 1933 adaptation of Don Quixote, as well as sweeping epics he witnessed in his youth, like Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments. Ilya found a love for comic books as a child living in New York City, and later gained an appreciation for science fiction in college, and would later credit Stanley Kubrick's 1968 opus 2001: A Space Odyssey with propelling him to make movies. And so it is fair to say that the hungry filmmaker sought to produce cinema on a grander scale. Come 1974, now on top of the world, Salkind was strolling down a street in Paris when the poster for a classic Zorro movie caught his attention. The black-caped hero, a longtime beacon of hope to the poor and disenfranchised, stuck in his mind, and it didn't take long for the impassioned producer to find his next money-making machine. The following day, having dinner with his father at a sidewalk cafe, Salkind impulsively unveiled his next cinematic expedition, one that he hoped would carry them well into the future. He revealed to his perplexed father that he wanted to bring a more modern caped figure to cinemas, and had set his sights on adapting the granddad of all superheroes in glorious fashion and at last bring Superman to the big screen. More so, he pictured a full-fledged multi-film franchise, evidencing the serialized nature of the comics and the success of the even then long-running James Bond series, an untapped well of potential riches. Alexander Salkind, on the other hand, was taken aback by the concept, the old-school producer not only having never heard of the character, but was unaccustomed to such wild flights of fancy, and so turned to his investors for impartial guidance. Fortunately, his nerves were put to rest with the reassurance from his financial backers that the property was a sound investment, and so the senior Salkind swiftly put the project into motion. But Ilya, ever the dreamer, was clear from the start that his Superman would have to be a real movie with real stars and a real Hollywood-sized budget, the first blockbuster comic book movie. And so, over a decade before Tim Burton's Batman, and 30 years ahead of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Ilya Salkind would usher in the era of the prestigious comic book film, and forever alter the landscape of mass-market movie making. Little did he know, however, that he was embarking on an unprecedented endeavor that would crash through the boundaries of contemporary filmmaking and push its creators far beyond their breaking points. But in the end, defined a hero for generations to come. In late 1974, a drawn-out negotiation process began with Superman and Detective Comics copyright holder National Periodic Publications, or NPP, which wouldn't be rebranded as DC Comics until 1977, and whose parent company was Warner Bros. Pictures. Although it would be safe to assume the studio kept one of their most popular properties under lock and key, in reality, Warner Bros. Saw no value at all in adapting a comic book into a feature film, and therefore left the negotiations to the Salkinds and NPP. Although George Lucas and Star Wars would step in a year ahead of the Salkinds and lay the groundwork for the incoming onslaught of high fantasy and sci-fi movie making, the cinematic landscape of the 1970s was drastically different from today's tentpole-focused release schedule. The late 1960s and early 70s brought about gritty, street-level dramas that put a mirror to the face of modern society and acted as the antithesis of the clean and inoffensive filmmaking of old Hollywood. Therefore, stories of men in tights flying through the sky were seen as strictly for kids, and certainly not something any self-respecting institution would throw tens of millions of dollars at. After an amicable but cautious meeting with Ilya Salkind in New York, NPP executives then traveled to Evian, France to meet with his more risk-adverse father, who, ironically, was downright terrified of flying. Following another convincing conversation, Ilya directed his producing partner and longtime friend, 27-year-old Pierre Spangler, to finalize the contract. However, what began as a straightforward licensing agreement turned into a weeks-long tug-of-war, because while Warner Bros. Was indifferent to their comic book royalties, NPP was deeply protective of what they saw as their most precious asset. At the time, the Man of Steel's most prominent on-screen exposure had been the 1948 black and white serial and its 1950 sequel, as well as the 1940s stereoscopic Technicolor animated shorts from Fleischer Studios, and later Famous Studios. However, what was perhaps most fresh in the minds of 1970s moviegoers was the 1950s-era television series starring George Reeves, although it was followed by a string of Saturday morning cartoons. Furthermore, the popular 1960s Batman TV parody starring Adam West and Burt Ward had set the standard for superhero adaptations, and NPP didn't want their most prized possession turned into the butt of a joke. So it is understandable that the character's first foray into big-budget movie making was handled with hyper-vigilance. And sensitive to their concerns, Ilya Salkind guaranteed that they would maintain the core values and morals instilled in the comics, and give the property a royal treatment. Lofty promises that were eventually made contractual. By November 1974, however, a deal between the two parties had still not been brokered, and the producers' patience with the picky rights holders was growing thin. Not wanting to waste any more time, Ilya Salkind decided to go over their heads and phoned Warner Communications publishing czar Bill Sarnoff, who held domain over NPP and DC Comics. With a stroke of his pen, the deal was at last finalized on behalf of the producers, and just like that, the Salkinds now owned the film and television rights to Superman for a quarter of a century. Despite coming to terms, however, albeit backhandedly, NPP demanded that a representative be present on set to ensure their Man in Blue was being handled with white gloves. The Salkind family long prided itself in its independent status, which was mostly thanks to Alexander Salkind's financial aptitude, having been given the moniker the Poet of Money by the French media. The fortune amassed from the success of the Musketeer films no doubt provided a great deal of control to the producers, and the ever-ambitious Salkinds now envisioned their Superman as an epic saga that told a sprawling story over the course of not one, but two major feature films. Moreover, they wanted to make certain that they would not repeat old mistakes, and so from the outset, the producers boldly planned to shoot both pictures simultaneously. However, unbeknownst to them, filming back-to-back special effects Latin behemoths would become so unwieldy that they would find themselves crawling back to Warner Brothers. Several writers were considered to give Superman his first feature film outing, and Ilya Salkind initially sought science fiction author and multimedia screenwriter Alfred Bester to develop a treatment. Bester is considered one of the pioneers of modern science fiction, and was no stranger to the comic book genre, having begun his professional career as a scriptwriter in the early 1940s for none other than DC Comics, having worked on such titles as Green Lantern, also contributing to Lee Falk's The Phantom and Mandrake the Magician. Unfortunately, Bester took the character in an unexpected direction, wanting to portray Clark Kent, not Superman, as the real hero of the story. And coupling this divergence with the fact that Alexander Salkind didn't feel Bester was a big enough name to slap on the film, the estimable writer's involvement was over before it began. For a splashier credit, the Salkinds met with novelist, playwright, and screenwriter William Goldman, who had just won the Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar for All the President's Men, following up his Oscar win for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid a few years earlier. The producers sat down with Goldman at New York's Plaza Hotel, but after 4 hours of conversation, the writer struggled to find his way into the story and bowed out of the running. At a loss, Ilya had a $250 million epiphany. To truly do justice to the Man of Tomorrow's cinematic ascendance, they needed to get the only man truly suited for this monumental quest, the guy who wrote The Godfather. And they would get him no matter the cost. And so the producers arranged yet another meeting with yet another writer. But this time it was Academy Award-winning screenwriter and best-selling author Mario Puzo. arguably the hottest scribe in Hollywood at the time. Although it seemed like a long shot, unlike Goldman, Puzo was instantly enthralled by the concept and eager to move forward. But to secure the writer, the producers had to take a hit to their pocketbook, and Puzo soon after signed a contract for a huge $350,000 payday, in addition to 5% of any gross profits. Superman marked a long personal and professional relationship between Puzo and the Salkinds. Despite his hefty salary, Puzo wasn't just in it for the money and took the job seriously, spending countless hours meeting with writers and executives at DC in order to accurately capture the essence of Superman's heightened reality. Puzo was also careful in choosing his characters among a vast gallery of friends and foes, as the Salkinds now had the rights to adapt anything and everything that had ever appeared in a Superman comic. In fact, NPP head Carmen Infantino worked closely with Puzo and the producers to hash out the story, and each word of Puzo's script, and every other variation that would come, had to be pre-approved by comic book executives. Bringing the characters to life on the page was undeniably fundamental to the production's success, but it was equally integral that they find the right filmmaker with the right vision to get Superman off the ground. To direct the film, the Salkinds made a long list of towering giants, including Francis Ford Coppola, William Friedkin, Peter Yates, Sam Peckinpah, and even a young George Lucas, but he was already steeped in a galaxy far, far away. Most, however, were simply deemed too expensive. Early on, even their Musketeers director Richard Lester pitched reworking the films into period pieces, but the producers wanted a Superman for the modern world, and so he was removed from consideration. But, as I'll discuss, this most certainly was not the end of Lester's Superman journey.
Jessica Lange as the beauty who charmed the beast.
John Gillerman had just completed the 1976 remake of King Kong when he fell into the running. And during the production of Jaws, Steven Spielberg was also being eyed for the job, but Alexander Salkind wanted to wait and see how the film turned out before committing. Unfortunately, by the time his shark movie reached blockbuster status, the in-demand filmmaker had already booked Close Encounters of the Third Kind as his next film. At last, the Salkinds turned to a reliable nuts-and-bolts action director and James Bond alumnus, Guy Hamilton. While the producers were also impressed by the scale of Hamilton's 1969 war epic Battle of Britain, the honorable British filmmaker had earned the faith of fans for directing Sean Connery and Roger Moore in 4 Bond entries, and therefore could be trusted to handle a valuable property with a skeptical fanbase. In July 1975, shortly after Hamilton was brought on board, Mario Puzo delivered the first draft of his script for both Superman and Superman 2, which totaled a lofty 220 pages, what Ilya Salkind later described as a Greek tragedy. It was Puzo's idea to take the Charles Dickens approach and have the film span 3 phases of Superman's life: his deliverance from Krypton, his development on Earth, and his ascension as world protector. Unfortunately, the decorated writer's script approached the material with maybe too much enthusiasm, spinning scenes and feats of superhuman strength so astounding and sequences so dense that it made the whole thing nearly unfilmable. What's more, the Salkinds and Puzo ended up charging ahead with a very self-aware adaptation of the comics, and the script therefore brimmed with goofy dialogue and wacky imagery. Furthermore, Clark Kent and Lois Lane had dramatically different roles than what ended up on the screen, with Clark written as a television anchor, which was accurate to the comics of the time, and Lois donning her Superwoman outfit in a romantic fantasy sequence. Locations ranged from a brawl at the local fair to the White House, to Vatican City, and beyond the stars. It was all a little too much. Hoping to salvage their time with Puzo, the producers summoned Norman Enfield to condense the material, having previously enlisted the multi-talented writer and regular crew member on their Musketeers production. But this attempt at course correction proved futile. And so, despite his lengthy investment, barely a word of Puzo's script would ever see the light of day. Forced back to the drawing board, the producers hired the Oscar-nominated writing team of Bonnie and Clyde, Robert Benton and David Newman, to bring Superman back down to Earth and reshape the script into something that resembled practical filmmaking. For better or worse, Benton and Newman were not newcomers to the world of Superman, the pair having co-written the well-reviewed but ill-fated 1966 Superman Broadway musical, an unprecedented $600,000 flop that fell on the wrong side of Broadway history. So, in a way, the Superman movies offered them a rare chance at artistic redemption. At the time, however, Benton was also a burgeoning director and eventually left the project, going on to write and direct the 1977 detective comedy The Late Show. As had been pre-arranged, David Newman's own wife, Leslie Newman, was brought in, the couple having just co-written the 1977 dramedy The Crazy American Girl, which also marked David's sole directing credit. The couple completed several drafts, and their final hefty two-movie screenplay, reportedly coming in at a mammoth 500 pages, was submitted to the producers in fall 1976. The Newmans introduced an even more comedic tone and parody, such as sneaking in a celebrity cameo from Telly Savalas, echoing his famous TV sleuth Kojak, or having Lex Luthor gobble up a box of tissues. The bloated script was in dire need of fresh eyes, and so Guy Hamilton asked Scottish author and screenwriter George MacDonald Fraser to slim it down. But according to the writer, his contributions were minuscule. Regardless, MacDonald Fraser's draft was the last submitted during Hamilton's tenure as director. While the writing of the film appeared to be finding its way, the producers became laser-focused on injecting genuine Hollywood gravitas into their production. Ilya Salkind knew that the first film, let alone the second, would never achieve liftoff unless bankable names headlined the marketing materials. But with only Mario Puzo's celebrity on the books, the production lacked a tried-and-true movie star to draw in bigger talent. However, everything soon changed when Salkind got a fateful call from Kurt Frings, one of the industry's most powerful talent agents, who had caught wind of the project and confidently told the desperate producer that, with the right number, he could get the Godfather himself. In the mid-1970s, there was perhaps no actor more revered than Marlon Brando, who, even at the relatively young age of 51, was considered a living Hollywood icon. And with his father's go-ahead, Ilya Salkind nervously sent the script in progress to the actor. Allegedly, the eccentric thespian read the mishmashed tome while on the toilet, and afterward told his representatives that he was intrigued, but with a catch. He would only take the part for what was then an impossible $3.5 million salary.
Tonight, we present a landmark in television entertainment. Roots.
It has also been rumored that Brando had his sights set on producing a Roots-style miniseries about the legacy of North American indigenous people, and hoped to at last partly self-fund the ambitious undertaking with his Superman fortune. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, this never came to fruition. Although not pleased to be presented with such an unreasonable offer, Alexander Salkind nervously gave his blessing. And so, in 1975, the trades shook as Brando signed a record-setting deal with the producers for a $3.7 million payday in addition to 11.75% of any gross profits, all for what would amount to approximately 20 minutes of screen time. While allotting such a large chunk of their budget to a single player was a painful decision, Ilya Salkind later said that if they hadn't signed Brando, there would have been no movie. Although he would forego the titular role, Dustin Hoffman was approached to play Superman's arch-nemesis, Lex Luthor, but again declined the producers. Fortunately, just days after Marlon Brando joined the project, star Gene Hackman's agent reached out to Ilya Salkind.
All right, Popeye's here. Get your hands on your heads. Get off the bar and get on the wall.
Hackman's career had come into its own by the 1970s. The actor then popularly known for his Academy Award-winning role as lone wolf detective Jimmy Popeye Doyle in William Friedkin's The French Connection, and had just appeared in its well-received sequel. Hackman had in fact been looking for an opportunity to work with Brando, and although the two would never actually share screen time, the star's interest came as a godsend to the producers, who were quick to cast the A-lister as the greatest mind of our time, signing a lucrative $2 million contract, which would have seemed egregious if it weren't for Brando's pricier demands. Although Hackman grew up a comic book buff and therefore was well acquainted with the diabolical character, he remained anxious about diving into the role full stop, concerned that such a silly performance might hurt his reputation as a serious dramatic actor. On accepting the part, Hackman said, "I don't know why they thought of me. I'm not sure I would have thought of me," and added that it was the best time he had on a movie set in recent memory, as the outlandish villain gave him, quote, "a license to steal," meaning he could do anything he wanted and get away with it.
I told you.
The casting of Brando and Hackman was a major turning point for the production, and gained the attention of top-tier talent and potential distributors. Although initially uninterested in backing the project, Warner Brothers came to the realization that they were sitting on a potential goldmine and immediately swooped in to form a negative pickup deal with the producers, an arrangement in which the Salkinds would manage and fund the production, with Warner Brothers acquiring the domestic distribution rights once the film was delivered, the two parties then splitting any net profits. With the script in hand, distribution secured, and its two headlining stars locked in, pre-production officially kicked off at Rome's Cinecittà Studios, construction beginning on multiple elaborate sets, and was where the filmmakers first faced the reality of answering the ultimate question: how do you make a man fly? The solution, it turned out, was far beyond what anyone could have predicted, as the technology to achieve on-screen flight would have to be built from the ground up, and ultimately required risky innovation and a deft performer to sell the effect. And the producers knew that the film's success arguably teetered on putting their Superman up in the sky. But the road to flight would be a long one, and unfortunately for the Salkinds, all of their earlier tests were unmitigated failures, which included an animated flying Superman, a remote toy plane made up to look like Superman, a literal dummy shot from a cannon, and it was even considered dangling a living stunt person from a 300-foot crane, which of course was scrapped due to safety concerns. All in all, Ilya Salkind claimed that the production burned through $2 million testing methods of simulated flight. Further aggravating the situation, Marlon Brando informed the producers that he would be unable to film any of his scenes in Italy. As it turned out, a warrant for his arrest was issued due to an obscenity charge that stemmed from his infamous 1972 erotic drama, Last Tango in Paris, and the actor had been informed that its director, Bernardo Bertolucci, was already in custody. Fortunately, however, the Salkinds had been eyeing a move to England all along, where the English pound would take their money much further than the Italian lira. And so it was a budgetary decision that scrapped production in Rome and transplanted the entire apparatus to the UK. But this too came at a cost. While Marlon Brando couldn't shoot in Italy, Director Guy Hamilton could not remain in the UK for more than 30 days per stay due to having a non-resident status, taking advantage of a loophole that allowed him to circumvent a costly tax law which would eliminate a huge portion of his salary if he stayed a day longer. Therefore, the Salkinds were left with a difficult choice: keep their director or retain their star. And wanting that big, bold Brando on the movie posters, the producers easily chose the latter and formally dismissed Hamilton, which added another $750,000 in severance pay to the production's price tag, an expense they hoped to recoup with Brando's involvement. By the time Hamilton left, the production had already wasted $6 to $7 million, and Alexander Salkind began to grow impatient with the lack of cohesion and a singular vision. With Ilya isolated in his temporary New York office, Alexander at home in France, and Pierre Spengler stationed at their Budapest headquarters, overseeing the production of their 1977 family adventure, The Prince and the Pauper, the producers were feeling stretched a little too thin, and the race to find a director intensified. Although the Salkinds first pursued Valley of the Dolls director Mark Robson to take over Superman's big screen debut, his 1974 disaster movie Earthquake having proven his ability to wield a modern big-budget spectacle, the summer of 1976 brought a film that fundamentally changed the nature of the production.
There are those who will kill for him. Who is he? What does he want? Where did he come from? And can he be stopped?
While not universally beloved even in its own day, The Omen followed in the footsteps of The Exorcist by delivering another horror blockbuster to cinemas, raking in over $60 million on a $2.8 million budget, and became a career breakthrough for one of popular filmmaking's most accomplished directors, Richard Donner, who, after nearly 2 decades in the industry, had finally found himself in the spotlight. Ultimately, Alexander Salkind favored Donner over Robson, partly because Donner was 47 years old and Robson was 63, and in fact, would sadly pass away a little over a year later in June 1978, well before the first film was even released. What's more, Donner was already good friends with Ilya Salkind's wife, Sky Aubrey, and came with a personal recommendation. At the time Donner was approached to possibly adopt the production, he was fast at work on a sequel to The Omen, and at the same time received an ominous phone call from none other than Musketeers director Richard Lester, who, according to Donner, firmly warned him not to go to work for the Salkinds, who, as I'll later cover, had failed to pay out Lester's box office dues for both films. Nevertheless, in January 1977, a single phone call from Ilya Salkind lured Donner away with the promise of a $1 million payday to direct 2 Superman films for Warner Brothers, more than 10 times what he made on The Omen. Upon accepting the job, Donner announced that he intended to start from scratch, finding the material he was handed to be totally inadequate, namely its overbearing campiness. The director felt that the world's first comic book superhero deserved a more earnest investment, and famously made verisimilitude his driving philosophy behind the film, or what Ilya Salkind later called a fiction reality, a constant reminder to not parody the material. Donner made it clear to every department that they were telling a true story set in the real world. And so, perhaps it is no coincidence that the film's first line of dialogue, spoken by Jor-El, states that this is no fantasy. To rewrite the script, Donner called his friend and frequent James Bond screenwriter Tom Mankiewicz, who took some convincing. The writer, of course, came with a family name that had its roots in classic Hollywood, and wasn't eager to take on yet another messy rewrite. Famously, Donner invited Mankiewicz to his LA home, where he found the director dressed in a full Superman costume that had been gifted to him by the Salkinds, and Mankiewicz was instantly won over by the filmmaker's childlike enthusiasm. and there agreed to help Donner rebuild Superman from the ground up. Unfortunately, Mankiewicz could not receive writing credit on the final film due to Writers Guild rules, with Mario Puzo, David and Leslie Newman, and Robert Benton being the only contributors credited. To circumvent this, Donner gave Mankiewicz a creative consultant credit, and the writer would go on to become Donner's right-hand man every step of the way, from casting to editing, and like Donner, was dedicated to preserving the dignity of the character. However, on one bizarre night out, Mankiewicz experienced what in hindsight may have been a bad omen. Not long after the writer joined the production, Ilya Salkind's own mother and Alexander's longtime wife, Berta Dominguez, began submitting unsolicited rewrites to Mankiewicz and Donner, both of whom were unenthused about their forced collaboration, and these tensions eventually came to a head at a fateful dinner. As Donner and Mankiewicz were sharing a meal with Marlon Brando, Ilya and Berta entered the restaurant and decided to join them. Predictably, the Salkind matriarch immediately began to grill Mankiewicz about her submissions not being included in the script, and the conversation soon got so heated that Berta snatched a steak knife off the table and lunged at Mankiewicz, but luckily was quickly restrained by a fast-acting Marlon Brando, who forced her back into her seat and shut down the kerfuffle. She was thereafter barred from the production. Mankiewicz essentially served in a role that was typically fulfilled by a producer, but Donner didn't view the Salkinds as reliable creative partners, but rather as moneymen whose ideas he had no intention of entertaining. He would later add that, as far as he was concerned, the producers had no clue as to what kind of movie they were making, and were solely interested in assembling it as cheaply as possible. It was, however, this immediate rift placed between Donner and the Salkinds that would lead to the near collapse of production. But well before all of that, they had to confront their greatest challenge, one that would decide the trajectory of their entire empire: finding their Superman. Rights holder NPP wasn't about to leave their most valuable character wholly in the hands of strangers who sought to profit from his name, and before the casting of Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman, they demanded a list of potential candidates to put on the cape, seeking a household name that would springboard the film to A-list status. Interestingly, Mario Puzo originally pitched having the same actor play Jor-El and Superman in order to have the lead on screen from the start, but his suggestion was never taken seriously. As requested, the Salkinds produced an initial list that bore heavy-hitting names like Muhammad Ali, Al Pacino, James Caan, Steve McQueen, and Clint Eastwood, and to their shock, NPP approved of all of them, although none of these personalities ever came close to an actual screen test. Desperate to lock in their star, Ilya Salkind made a bold lateral move and offered the role to Robert Redford for an unheard-of $6 million salary. But the unswayed actor politely declined, feeling that his fame would overshadow the character. To drum up more buzz and draw in further Hollywood royalty, Salkind resorted to unconventional lengths. These tactics included hosting a nighttime laser light show at Battery Park on the Hudson River, which formed the Superman insignia in the night sky and read "Coming Soon, Superman the Movie," and a more treacherous attempt at the 1976 Cannes Film Festival, wherein a helicopter was hired to fly a banner advertising the film's growing star power, but unexpected winds nearly sent it crashing into the bay, tearing up the banner in the process. The following year, another failed aerial advertisement over the festival saw one of two airplanes grounded due to inclement weather, and the other proudly carrying a banner that misspelled Alexander Salkind's name, reading "Superman the Movie to be a production from Alexander Salkind." Nonetheless, headliners like Burt Reynolds and Sylvester Stallone found themselves in talks, with Stallone having actively pursued the part, but the filmmakers felt he looked too Italian for their Kansas farm boy. Having failed to get Robert Redford, the producers also went after Paul Newman, who was given his pick of the big three, Luthor, Jor-El, or Superman, in addition to a $4 million take-home. But the actor was unmoved by the material. Other big names in the running included James Brolin, Christopher Walken, Nick Nolte, Jon Voight, and even Neil Diamond, who was looking to kickstart his acting career. Warren Beatty, who had undoubtedly aged out of the role by the mid-1970s, was even given a prototype costume to try on, but the actor said he felt ridiculous and dismissed the possibility. A young Arnold Schwarzenegger also lobbied for the role and was at one point seriously considered, if only for his larger-than-life physique, but the producers felt his thick Austrian accent was an insurmountable obstacle. However, this feverish hunt for a movie star fell to the wayside with the boarding of Brando and Hackman. Richard Donner and the producers now confident that they had enough gravitas to risk the casting of an unknown actor to lead their film, wanting to ensure that audiences would only ever see Superman on the screen, and not the actor playing him. Ilya Salkind's first choice was Olympic gold medal winner Caitlyn Jenner, but as skilled as she proved to be as a decathlete, there was no time to develop her acting abilities, and after auditioning in Rome, they went their separate ways. Infamously, even Salkind's wife's dentist, Don Voight, who came with some acting experience, was brought in for a screen test merely for his physical resemblance to the character, but again, was not a viable choice. Not long after auditions began, however, one candidate in particular caught the eye of casting director Lynn Stallmaster, who suggested to Donner that he audition the then 24-year-old stage and screen actor Christopher Reeve. Reeve had been discovered his freshman year at Cornell University, where he had found his calling in the theater department, having received a letter by one of New York's most prominent talent agents, Stark Hesseltine, who then represented names like Michael Douglas and Susan Sarandon. Wanting to further develop his skills, Reeve later transferred to Juilliard to focus solely on performing, and in 1974 landed his first prominent on-camera role in the CBS soap opera Love of Life, all along finding work in commercials and on and off Broadway productions. In early 1977, he won his first part in a feature film as a junior officer in the Charlton Heston vehicle Grey Lady Down, but nonetheless continued his work on the stage. It was here, however, that his agent recommended the handsome 6'4" actor put his hat in the ring for Warner Brothers' Superman. Although Reeve's headshot and resume immediately caught the attention of Lynn Stallmaster, at a glance, Donner and the producers not only felt he was too young, wanting someone around 30 years old, but that he was also too scrawny, with Ilya Salkind describing him as pencil thin, and so they moved on to the next name in the stack, going on to see over 200 candidates for the part. However, Stallmaster was so convinced that Reeve was the one that he moved his name to the top of the list no less than 3 separate times. And according to Ilya Salkind, he too eventually gravitated toward Reeve, who he felt had the face and demeanor needed for the character. And so, along with Stallmaster's persistence, Donner and the producers agreed to arrange a brief meeting with the actor to size him up. The future collaborators met in a Manhattan hotel room, and according to Reeve, discussed everything but Superman. However, at one point in their conversation, Richard Donner removed his own glasses and handed them to Reeve to try on, and at that moment, the hopeful actor knew he had passed a preliminary test. Reeve was also pleased to learn that Donner and the Salkinds were making a serious film, and was more so excited by the prospect of acting alongside Gene Hackman and Marlon Brando. Hoping to demonstrate his stage presence, Reeve invited Donner and the producers to watch him in a play that night, and taken by his commanding performance, Reeve was afterwards sent a copy of the 300-page 2-film script, with his screen test scheduled for February 1977 at Shepperton Studios. Despite this huge step forward, Reeve was still not confident he would get the job, and spent his wintry flight to the UK mulling over his approach to the character. It occurred to him that the image of the American male had shifted from the hard-nosed tough guy of previous generations to a gentler and more emotionally open figure, and the actor aimed to exude this modern archetype in his performance. Reeve also did not want to overplay the part and made a point to portray the character as relaxed and approachable as possible, knowing his own intimidating stature carried enough power to convey his strength to the audience. For Superman's alter ego, Clark Kent, on the other hand, it was important to the actor that there be a distinctive difference between the mild-mannered reporter and the Man of Steel. Taking inspiration from Cary Grant's Dr. David Huxley in Bringing Up Baby, Reeve crafted a Clark who was moralistically wholesome but physically inept, and would continue to fine-tune the character throughout filming. Reeve said that it took him longer to find his portrayal of Superman, and that Clark was always the more complex and interesting side to play, and the one he related to the most. Writer Tom Mankiewicz also offered some advice, telling Reeve that while he was always playing Superman, when he put on the glasses, he was playing Superman playing Clark Kent. In other words, he had a role within a role. In a contemporary interview, the actor made it clear that there was much more to his Superman than deflecting bullets. In a sense, Reeve said, he is a stranger in a strange land, a solitary man with extraterrestrial powers, trying hard to fit into his adopted planet. He has warmth and a fine sense of humor, even about his own superhuman strength.
Wouldn't you know it? Story of my life. The single most important interview since Moses talked to God, and Mr. Wonderful is...
Wish!
late.
Good evening, Miss Lane.
Careful, you'll... Okay, so you won't.
Thank you very much for finding the time for this interview. I realize there must be many questions about me the world would like to know the answers to. So it's become important to me to have close relations with the press.
Although diffident, Reeve astonished the producers with a show-stopping audition, and just moments after he finished, Donner rang Ilya Salkind to inform him that they found their Superman. The soon-to-be movie star signed a 2-film deal for the comparatively small sum of $250,000 for his work in both films. Although it had already leaked to the press, his casting was made public via a special media event held on February 23, 1977, inside Sardi's restaurant in New York City, with Reeve, Donner, and the producers all present. Once cast, Reeve said that he was forced to say no to the Salkinds' elaborate stunt marketing schemes on a daily basis, which ranged from an in-costume appearance at a junior high school to walking out onto the football field during halftime at the Rose Bowl accompanied by a full marching band. Reeve eventually had to have a sit-down with the producers, as he felt anyone who saw him in costume with their own eyes would then expect to see him take off into the clouds, and he didn't want to disappoint fans prematurely. While Reeve proved to be the perfect fit in spirit, at just 188 pounds, he was still far too wiry to suit the character's traditional strongman physique, but also refused to wear padding under his suit.
Save your time and ammunition, Benson.
Fortunately, the actor was also an accomplished athlete, and so not long after his casting, Reeve began an intensive 2-month-long training process under the guidance of champion British weightlifter David Prowse, who had also just embodied Darth Vader in George Lucas's Star Wars for the first time. Interestingly, Prowse had lobbied for both the part of Superman and Non, but was deemed an ill fit for either and was handed the job of Reeve's trainer as consolation. Under Prowse's supervision, Reeve started his days with a morning run followed by skipping rope, 2 hours of weightlifting, and an hour and a half on the trampoline. To fuel his growth, he adhered to a strict diet of milk and steak, ultimately piling on as much as 30 pounds of muscle. However, Reeve was still bodybuilding well into principal photography, and so his weight visibly fluctuates throughout both films, making it clear which scenes were shot first. Unfortunately, Reeve and Prowse reportedly had a falling out toward the end of his training, as Reeve, who was panicked about gaining enough bulk to fill out his costume, claimed he lost precious muscle mass while Prowse unexpectedly went out of country for 10 days, and lashed out at the trainer upon his return, Shortly after, Prowse was dismissed by the producers. Reeve was in fact so jittery about the role that he asked Tom Mankiewicz to arrange a meeting with former James Bond star Sean Connery, seeking his advice and perspective on sustaining an acting career while portraying a pop cultural icon. While Connery was not keen on any formal discussions, he later ran into Reeve at a party and bestowed the following advice. If it's a big hit, Connery told him, do something completely different from your next picture. And if the second one's a big hit, get yourself the best lawyer and agent in the world and stick it to them. On working with Reeve, Gene Hackman said that he wouldn't have played Superman for anything, and prior to filming, would have advised against his younger co-star accepting the part, due to the high likelihood of typecasting. However, once shooting commenced, Hackman had a change of heart, and saw that Reeve was equipped with enough talent to rise above it. Nevertheless, Reeve himself was unable to escape the nagging feeling that Superman was as likely to ruin his career as it was to make it, and therefore he took fierce ownership of the role. The actor viewed himself as a temporary custodian of the character, explaining that he saw his casting as a passing of the torch from the previous generations of actors who wore the cape, and therefore had little sense of ease or humor about the job.
166, take 1.
As imperative as it was to find a performer who exuded Superman's qualities and values, choosing their Lois Lane was an equally integral feat, although unlike Reeve, they wanted an experienced co-star to stand opposite their hero. At first, names like Anne Archer, Susan Blakely, Leslie Ann Warren, and Deborah Raffin were in consideration, but the candidates eventually whittled down to just two names, a young Stockard Channing and the then 29-year-old Canadian-American actor Margot Kidder. While Donner and Mankiewicz viewed Channing as the better fit, Ilya Salkind leaned toward Kidder, who he not only felt looked more like the character, but there was a concern that Channing's larger-than-life performance would overshadow Reeve. At the time, Kidder was known for her role in the 1974 slasher cult classic Black Christmas, although she had already appeared in 11 feature films, and first caught the attention of Lynn Stallmaster in the single-season TV western Nichols, where she co-starred alongside James Garner. However, the vibrant young actor was as far away from a city girl as one could be, having grown up riding horses in Canada's Northwest Territories, and showed up to her screen test in boots and a cowboy hat. Because comic books had been forbidden by her parents, Kidder said she had no idea what she was getting into.
Well, just how fast do you fly?
Oh, I don't know, really. You know, I've never actually timed myself. Say, why don't we find out together?
And just how do you suggest that we do that?
Well, you could take a ride with me. Right now, if you'd like to.
A ride? You mean I could fly?
On her casting, Kidder later stated that she had spent her entire childhood dreaming of becoming a rich and famous movie star, and that Superman allowed her to realize that dream. That being said, Kidder later admitted that her newfound fame came as a rude awakening, and that she didn't cope well with the loss of her anonymity. Although their chemistry shines through on screen, Kidder and Reeve had drastically different styles of working, with Kidder being more playful and laid back, and Reeve treating his role with the utmost sincerity, even choosing to remain in character when cameras weren't rolling. Therefore, the actors were often heard bickering on set, and it took some time for the co-stars to find their harmony. To fill out the supporting cast, Ilya Salkind provided Richard Donner with a long list of potential stars, some of whom Donner engaged and others he did not. Casting the second of Kal-El's parental pillars, Jonathan Kent, again sent Donner after a lauded Hollywood name, and Superman marked veteran actor Glenn Ford's 200th film credit. Ford was a natural choice as he had worked with Donner on the 1971 television movie The Marshal of Madrid, an extension of Ford's short-lived Western TV series Cades County, and so they shared a professional rapport. Like Reeve, Ford said that what excited him most about the production was that they were playing it straight, although it was initially planned to have the actor wear a big white wig similar to Brando's, but Ford felt silly and convinced them otherwise. Notorious silver screen icon Joan Crawford was the producer's first choice to play Martha Kent, but her death in May 1977 put those plans to rest, and Ilya Salkind's wife, Sky Aubrey, next suggested another old Hollywood starlet, her mother, then 58-year-old Phyllis Thaxter, who was soon after awarded the role. Salkind remained Thaxter's son-in-law through the production of both Superman films, although his marriage to Aubrey ended in divorce in 1979, a year before the sequel's release. To head the Daily Planet, the Odd Couple star Jack Klugman initially accepted the role of the cigar-chomping editor-in-chief Perry White, but suddenly reversed his decision and passed on the part. Next, Green Acres' own Eddie Albert said yes to the role, but after demanding a bigger salary, he walked away. Finally, character actor Keenan Wynn was cast, but upon arriving on set for filming, although some sources state it was at London's Heathrow Airport, the actor suffered a fainting spell and was instead rushed to a hospital, later diagnosed with exhaustion and forced to depart the project. With some quick thinking, Tom Mankiewicz reached out to his acquaintance, actor Jason Robards, who had just earned an Oscar for playing a real newspaper editor in All the President's Men, but alas, he wasn't interested. And so, with no time to spare, Donner called up an old reliable name, Jackie Cooper, who was told he could only have the job if he had a passport ready to go. Cooper accepted the role despite having sworn off acting multiple times in his later career, and came with a 50-year resume in the motion picture industry, having first appeared on screen at just 3 years old and having become a worldwide star by the age of 5. And by the time Superman came into his life, he was an established director and producer. At 20 years old, Mark McClure became the youngest member of the core cast when he won the part of fresh-faced Daily Planet photographer Jimmy Olsen, although the actor's features noticeably mature over the two films. Before Superman, McClure was best known for playing Boris Harris in 1976's Freaky Friday, and would go on to become the only actor to appear in character in all 5 films within the Christopher Reeve universe, which includes the infamous 1984 spin-off movie Supergirl. Academy Award nominee Ned Beatty wasn't the Salkind's first choice to play Otis, Lex Luthor's dim-witted henchman, and in fact, Peter Boyle was in negotiations for the role before he bowed out due to unspecified reasons. Although Beatty had been raised in a strict conservative household and wasn't permitted to read comics or go to the movies, he said that he went anyway and, quote, devoured comics like gumdrops, interpreting them as modern American mythology. By accepting the buffoonish part, the actor was certainly playing against type, then most known for his cold and calculating performance as media tycoon Arthur Jensen in Network, and described Otis as one step above a moron and an awfully bad guy. Ilya Salkind said that he regretted the campiness of the Otis character, as well as the amount of time spent following him back to Luthor's headquarters, which amounted to an almost 5-minute chunk of the theatrical version and an 8-minute segment in the television cut. 1970's it girl Goldie Hawn was the producer's first choice to play Eve Tessmacher, Luthor's much prettier cohort, but her salary demand was too extravagant, and so they next solicited Anne Margaret, who accepted the role. However, the same day Margaret signed with the producers, Valerie Perrine offered to take the part for half of Margaret's asking price, and so they dropped Margaret despite having finalized her contract, indifferent to any impending lawsuit. Perrine, a former Vegas showgirl, Playboy model, and Academy Award nominee, said on her character, "Eve isn't really a bad person. She's a bit dumb and a bit of a masochist because she puts up with all of Lex's weirdness." While her relationship with Luthor almost seems platonic, Superman's televised version includes an extended scene that ends with the pair sharing an intimate moment. London native Lee Quigley was just 7 months old when cast as Infant Kal-El, which technically made him the first non-American performer to play Superman. And at just under 3 years old, Calgary native Aaron Smolinski made his screen debut as toddler Clark, who greets Ma and Pa Kent in his birthday suit. Further footage featuring Smolinski was shot, which showed the super kid helping around the Kent family farm, as well as yet another young actor brought in to play a slightly older Clark for further scenes showing his upbringing. But all this failed to make the final cut and has never resurfaced. Jeff East was only a few years younger than Christopher Reeve when cast as teenage Clark, which not only required him to don a fake nose and endure 3 to 4 hours in the makeup chair each day, but unbeknownst to him, his lines would later be dubbed by Reeve himself in post-production. Although East's performance wasn't an issue, as he and Reeve had spent some time together coordinating their mannerisms, the producers felt that looking and acting like Reeve wasn't enough, which of course begs the question, why not cast Reeve? East also tore his thigh muscles while filming the scene showing Clark running alongside the train, the actor having been suspended from wires off the side of a speeding truck, and so his feet never actually touched the ground. The film also sports an impressive supporting cast, and in addition to setting up its sequel with brief appearances from Terrence Stamp, Sarah Douglas, and Jack O'Halloran as Zod, Ursa, and Non respectively, Brando was certainly not the only celebrity on the Krypton set. BAFTA winner and Oscar nominee Susanna York was handed the role of Lara, Superman's birth mother, and Jor-El's bureaucratic challengers were played by screen legends Trevor Howard and Harry Andrews, with celebrated German actor Maria Schell given the role of the competing scientist, Wanda. On Trevor Howard's part at least, it wasn't difficult to conjure the character's ire for Jor-El, as he and Brando had a long-standing feud that they carried to their graves. Smaller parts were also cast with top-notch talent. Clark's boyhood crush, cheerleader Lana Lang, was played by future author Diane Sherry Case, who at the time came with an over 12-year career as a child and teen actor across film and television. Her character gets a little more screen time in the television cut, as I'll cover.
Come on, get in here, hurry up.
Actor and folk singer Weston Gavin plays the impudent mugger who attempts to rip off Lois's purse, only to end with Clark catching a bullet. Ray Hassett and Steve Kane respectively play Metropolis detectives Harry and Armis, who stalk Otis to Luthor's lair to a bitter end. Notably, Kane just happened to be the cousin of Richard Donner, and would go on to make appearances in almost all of his films. Character actor David Baxt won the part of a burglar scaling a Metropolis skyscraper who has a vertical run-in with Superman. Funny enough, a decade later, Baxt would be cast as Bruce Wayne's father, Thomas Wayne, in Tim Burton's Batman. British actor Frank Lazarus was cast as the Air Force One pilot who spots a newly debuted Superman giving a helping hand. Like Jeff East, however, his own speaking voice was deemed a poor fit for the character, as Lazarus allegedly struggled to disguise his natural accent, and so he was dubbed over by a voice actor.
Don't look, just fly.
Richard Donner later described this as an embarrassing decision.
Roger, Air Force One, Metropolis currently seeing...
Fun fact, Christopher Reeve also provided the voice of the airline tower operator heard in this scene.
Good evening, Officer Mooney.
Officer Mooney is doubtlessly the most popular performance of actor George Harris II's 4 feature film credits, but veteran actor Rex Everhart brought a nearly 20-year film and television career to his role as Mooney's desk sergeant.
First bottle's on me. Let me get my hat.
London-based child actor Jane Totman plays the little girl whose cat is rescued from a tree by a flying friend, and a young John Ratzenberger presumably plays the same character in each of the 2 films, credited as the first controller on both productions. What's more, the first film offers up a series of fun cameos, most notably Kirk Allen, the first live-action Superman, and Noelle Neal, the first live-action Lois, who play the parents of a young Lois Lane aboard the train teenage Clark zips by. Although this scene was cut from the theatrical release, it was later restored to the special edition version, although the actors are still briefly visible in the original cut for those with a quick eye. Just before he began his legendary turn as slimy oil tycoon J.R. Ewing in Dallas, Larry Hagman cameoed as a Randy Army major as a favor to writer Tom Mankiewicz, with Superman marking the fourth time Hagman appeared in a film written by Mankiewicz. While his appearance is brief, the actor ended up shooting for almost a month. Controversial film critic Rex Reed also pops up outside the Daily Planet, playing himself, as well as New York Daily News critic Kathleen Carroll, who went on to give a glowing review. And lastly, the warden of the prison where Superman delivers Luthor and Otis was played by character actor Roy Stevens, although it was an uncredited David DeKeyser who dubbed over Stevens' voice to deliver the first film's famous send-off.
This country is safe against Superman, thanks to you.
No, sir. Don't thank me, Warden. We're all part of the same team. Night.
Principal photography was scheduled to launch at England's legendary Pinewood Studios on March 28, 1977, and the producers gave themselves only a year to pull it off, Part 1 being slated for release in June 1978 to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Action Comics #1. Reportedly, the Salkinds hoped to sustain a budget of $15 to $20 million per film, but as I'll discuss, unforeseen complications would force it to become the most expensive production ever attempted at that time.
These are matters of undeniable fact. I ask you now to pronounce judgment on those accused.
Marlon Brando's scenes had to be prioritized due to the actor's contract stipulating only 11 days of filming, although he ended up conceding a 12th, and so the opening sequence on Krypton was the first thing committed to celluloid. Although Brando arrived to the Krypton set sick with a cold, and despite his unsociable personality, the star was reportedly easy to direct and personally greeted each crew member with a handshake, although he was described as shy by many on the production. Like Glenn Ford, Brando was also at first opposed to his white spick curled wig, but Donner eventually coaxed him into it. Donner said that he was initially bothered by the inequity of Brando's immoderate pay, and so was trepidatious when he, Tom Mankiewicz, and Ilya Salkind first sat down with the star at his Los Angeles home. Salkind had warned the pair that Brando had already alluded to wild deviations from the core concept, the enigmatic actor cheekily having suggested that Kryptonians not look like humans, and that maybe he should instead appear as an inanimate object, such as a green suitcase. But when he met with Donner and Mankiewicz, he added the idea of playing a cosmic bagel that speaks in electronic noises to the mix, all of which immediately put the filmmakers on edge. However, Donner brought the star back to reality by explaining that every person age 6 and up knew what Jor-El was supposed to look like. And after seeing an image of the character, Brando conceded and gave the director his full cooperation.
I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree whose branches wide and strong. The Camptown ladies sing this song. Doo-dah, doo-dah.
As was commonplace at that point in his career, Brando contractually did not memorize his dialogue, which required large cue cards and other creative methods of line delivery to be used on set, and also declined to participate in either film's marketing campaigns. However, to his credit, the actor did invite press to the set to play up his involvement and help generate positive buzz. Brando claimed that not learning his lines was a way to make his acting more naturalistic, saying that because he could not predict which words were going to come to his own mind, his characters shouldn't know either. In addition to cue cards, for certain shots the dialogue had to be hidden in the set itself, such as when Jor-El gives his farewell monologue to his Earth-destined son. The script reportedly placed inside baby Kal-El's interstellar crib. Regardless of his unorthodox and some might say lazy method, Brando delivered Jor-El's monologue unrehearsed and in one take, which led to a spontaneous eruption of applause from behind the cameras. On a related note, although the character's roots actually derived from Jewish tradition, namely the story of Moses, Superman's Christ-like arc was also not lost on the filmmakers, and Donner and writer Tom Mankiewicz certainly played up the relationship between Kal-El and Jor-El as God the Father and Jesus the Son. Even Zod and his cohort's banishment mirrors God's casting out of Lucifer. Unfortunately, this symbolism didn't play well to all, as Richard Donner would later receive death threats from religious extremists. As I'll cover, Christopher Reeve and Brando actually did share the screen in a scene excised for reasons I'll discuss, and in an interview with David Letterman on working with Brando, Reeve had the following to say.
I must say, I don't say this to be vicious, but I don't worship at the altar of Marlon Brando because I feel that he's copped out in a certain way. He's no longer in the leadership position that he could be. He could really be inspiring a whole generation of actors and by continuing to work. But what happened is the press loved him whether he was good, bad, or indifferent, where people thought he was this sort of institution no matter what he did. So he doesn't care anymore, and I just think it would be sad to be 53, whatever he is, and not give a damn, that's all. I just think it's too bad that the man has kind of been forced into that hostility.
You don't even care where the other missile's headed, do you?
On the contrary, I know exactly where it's headed. Hackensack, New Jersey.
Gene Hackman was also only available for a limited time, and so all of his scenes had to be shot up front. What's more, the actor refused to shave his head and mustache to match Lex Luthor's trademark cue ball appearance, which led to the development of the character's affinity for wigs in the film. Although Hackman of course sported a bald cap for his final scene for the first film and for the prison scene at the start of the second. While his curled locks remained, the actor was famously tricked by Richard Donner into shaving his mustache, who supposedly agreed to shave his own facial hair if Hackman conceded. Little did Hackman know, however, Donner was wearing a phony mustache. Luckily, the star didn't take offense when Donner tore it off his face, and found the ruse amusing. Nonetheless, the first announcement poster for the film featured both Brando and a very mustachioed Gene Hackman. Guy Hamilton and the Salkinds originally based their art direction on what they saw in Superman's comic book panels, but Donner felt this approach didn't translate to the real world. Therefore, to breathe life into the film's fantastical backdrops, he called on the talents of acclaimed British production designer John Barry. Then known for A Clockwork Orange and Lucky Lady, Barry also took home an Oscar for Star Wars that same year, and Donner referred to the master designer as a genius, adding that he could talk with a pencil. It was Barry who imagined both Krypton and the Fortress of Solitude as palaces of ice and crystal, and the colossal alien sets were constructed at both the Pinewood 007 soundstage and the equally storied Sea Stage at Shepperton Studios, all under the supervision of Barry and art directors Stuart Craig and Norman Reynolds. These sprawling structures were further extended with the aid of carefully crafted matte paintings to emphasize the vastness of Superman's homeworld, in addition to detailed miniatures for establishing shots, most notably the ominous dome that unfolds and later collapses over the Kryptonian court. The same methods were employed to create Superman's Arctic sanctuary, which reused many elements from the Krypton set, but unlike the heightened palatial architecture found in the original comics, here it obviously mirrors Krypton's own wild structures. That being said, according to Richard Donner, conditions on set were anything but icy, as the studio lights slowly boiled actors and crew members with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And so much atmospheric smoke was pumped out that the set doors had to be propped open for ventilation. Gene Hackman grew so upset over having to stand around in furs under the sultry lights that he smashed the little black box prop against the floor, breaking it into pieces. At one point, the pillars of light bordering Jarrell and Lara's home were sucking up so much power that they blew out the studio's transformers. This was made all the more harrowing by the fact that Barry and his team were working 20-hour shifts, and the entire Krypton sequence was designed, built, costumed, cast, and filmed in just 10 weeks, with over 350 construction workers employed. Ultimately, it seems their suffering was well worth the sacrifice, at least for the Salkinds, as Warner Brothers was so enamored with the Krypton footage that they again renegotiated their contract to give at least film number 1 a broad international release. Other notable sets built during the first production included Lex Luthor's elaborate subterranean lair, Lois's rooftop patio, the upper portion of the Hoover Dam, the molten underground of the San Andreas Fault, the prison interiors and exterior walls, the surface of the moon and the NASA control room, a Niagara Falls newlywed suite, the Oval Office, Don's Diner, and the frosty shores seen in young Clark's journey of self-discovery. However, the production's decision to use salt here as a substitute for snow meant that corrosion was a serious risk to all equipment, as a single grain could ruin a multi-$1,000 camera. The crew also resorted to wearing rubber-soled shoes to prevent the salt from eating through their leather bottoms. The offices of the Daily Planet were created at Pinewood's E Stage, Donner and Barry wanting to evoke the chaos of a modern newsroom without having to actually film inside of one, with meticulous detail brought to each workstation and every scrap of paper, allowing Donner the freedom to move the actors and cameras within a fully realized space. For all Metropolis exteriors, filming later moved to New York City in the summer of 1977, where a relentless heat wave reigned over the 5-week shoot. The production also drew massive groups of curious onlookers wherever they went. The New York Daily News building doubled for the exterior of the Daily Planet, and Manhattan's Grand Central Terminal was used for Otis's trek to Luthor's subway penthouse, with filming also taking place in the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood. A full-size yacht was parked in the middle of Manhattan for the shot showing the aftermath of a failed heist, the same vessel later being returned to the water for the filming of the preceding scene. Here, set photographer Bob Penn also shot Reeve in full costume outside the Mayflower Hotel, a wire pulling on his cape having provided the effect of it majestically blowing in the breeze.
Easy, miss. I've got you.
You've got me! Who's got you?
For the skyscraping helicopter rescue, the U.S. Post Office building on Lexington Avenue was used for exterior shots, and filming on the roof of the 111 Wall Street building showed the copter's takeoff. Although this was a last-minute substitute, the production was originally scheduled to film atop the Pan Am building, now the MetLife building, but had to switch locations after a real-life helicopter tragedy occurred on its rooftop in May 1977, just weeks before they planned to shoot, which resulted in the deaths of 5 people. Superman's first big-screen rescue was filmed over the course of 6 months, with 5 units working in 2 different countries. The shots of Clark looking for an appropriate place to swap outfits and spinning into Superman were filmed on location, and all footage of the rescue itself, as well as the shots on the rooftop, were filmed in London.
That's a bad outfit.
However, nothing compared to the events that began on the evening of July 13th, 1977, when, in the middle of filming, the lights suddenly vanished across the city, and the infamous New York blackout began. As it turned out, a series of lightning strikes had hit critical power lines belonging to Con Edison, the region's top power supplier. This disastrous outage led to 24 hours of looting, arson, and riots, causing over 500 injuries and an estimated $300 million in total damages. All of which, of course, led to a complete shutdown of the New York unit. However, without a doubt, filming the Air Force One rescue scene turned out to be one of the production's most tragic endeavors, as stuntman and metalworker Terry Hill was killed after a gigantic replica wing detached and landed on top of him. Another horrendous loss came when electrician John Bodemede was electrocuted on set, but further details surrounding his death have never been released. Although the producers were quick to keep the incidents out of the headlines, the closing credits of Superman the movie dedicates the film to these late crew members. For the first film's climactic scenes, depicting the West Coast carnage unleashed by Lex's missiles, Donner had to fight to shoot on location in Gallup, New Mexico, as Ilya Salkind was demanding that it be shot at Pinewood for a lesser cost. Ultimately, the director had to ensure the backing of Warner Brothers executives in order to secure the necessary funds. The Hoover Dam at Lake Mead was also used for establishing in aerial shots, but a scale replica was made for its destruction, along with a model village to be washed away. Additionally, a 70-foot-long, 20-foot-high scale model of San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge was used for the earthquake sequence, including miniature cars for the colliding vehicles. The first unit made the move to Canada in August 1977, where the plains of Alberta stood in for Kansas and Superman's rural hometown of Smallville, with the Kent family farmstead having been built in Blackie. Ilya Salkind said that a Canadian farm was chosen over an American property simply because the Canadian wheat fields thrived later into the year. Pa Kent's funeral and the Smallville cemetery were filmed in Bainin, although the small chapel scene in the background was actually a 5-foot model. The local high school was captured in Barrons, and several of the students seen running off the football field were played by contest winners who, unbeknownst to the producers, were promised cameos by a DC Comics marketing campaign. In the Canadian Rockies, which doubled for Colorado, Luthor's missile hijacking was filmed, and his remote-controlled car ended up being a headache for director Richard Donner, and took 3 takes and 3 setups to get right. The exploding gas station was also captured in Alberta. The Niagara Falls sequence, as seen in Superman 2, in which Superman rescues a little boy and Clark and Lois's relationship gets waterlogged, was originally planned to be shot while the production was in Canada, but the producers decided to postpone its filming in order to get the crew back to England as quickly as possible. Other smaller scenes that were written but not filmed due to scheduling included a love-rattled Superman correcting the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which of course later ended up in Superman 3, and Superman having a brief encounter with English fox hunters. Of course, all of these miraculous sets and stunning locations would have been for naught if it wasn't for the lionized British cinematographer Geoffrey Unsworth, who was praised for having shot Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, Sidney Lumet's Murder on the Orient Express, and Richard Attenborough's war epic, A Bridge Too Far, and had just won an Oscar for Bob Fosse's Cabaret. Donner said that he had originally sought Unsworth to shoot The Omen, but he was unavailable, and so was the first name that came to mind when looking for the right creative eye to capture Superman. Unsworth's regular camera operator, Peter McDonald, was more often in charge of the camera's movement, while Unsworth managed the lighting. Combined with Donner's approach of long choreographed takes and shots of breathtaking scope, Superman the movie offers one of the most striking canvases of 1970s cinema. Known as a master of light, Ilya Salkind referred to Unsworth as a painter, and Richard Donner used his lens to divide the film into 3 distinctive visual palettes: Krypton representing the look and feel of a science fiction film, Smallville evoking Norman Rockwell and Andrew Wyeth with its soft filter 1950s costumes and sweeping rural landscapes, and the scenes in Metropolis offering a blend of bright comic colors and a grittier naturalism, Donner hoping to retain as many real-world elements as possible. According to cast and crew, Unsworth was nothing but a pleasure to work with, and was highly respected by everyone involved. Sadly, Superman would be his last completed film, the 64-year-old having died of a heart attack in France during the post-production of Roman Polanski's Tess. As a result, both Superman and the Michael Crichton heist comedy The Great Train Robbery are dedicated to Unsworth. Long before the days of muscle padding and heavy alternative fabrics, superheroes wore tights, and costume designer Yvonne Blake said that her goal was to maintain Reeve's masculinity and physical presence while not making him look silly. At the time, Blake was best known for Jesus Christ Superstar and having costumed the Salkinds Musketeer films, and lifted Superman's vibrant uniform straight off the page. It was Marlon Brando's suggestion, however, that Superman's iconic insignia also be his Kryptonian family crest. A bit of lore that has long since been integrated into the comics. Unfortunately for Reeve, the fabric chosen was a special nylon and spandex material that left almost no breathing room on the actor, and therefore all costumes would eventually be fitted with absorbent padding around the areas where Reeve's sweat showed, combined with intensive antiperspirant, blow drying, and other strategies. Regardless of their efforts, his stained underarms are clearly noticeable at certain moments. Due to the use of blue screen in some of the flying shots, Reeve had to change into different costumes with specific shades of blue in order to avoid turning transparent on film. Likewise, multiple capes were produced to serve various purposes, such as one that accommodated wires and a rigid cape that didn't drape over Reeve's back. The actor also wore different boots depending on the shot, some made for walking and some for flying. Reeve was not permitted to be seen in full costume when off camera, the producers not wanting any leaks seen out of context, and so the star had to wear a robe between takes. Reeve's hair was another obstacle for the production, his natural color being a lighter brown and patchy due to his struggle with alopecia. Therefore, his hair not only had to be dyed black for both films, but Reeve donned a full black wig when playing Superman, although in some earlier shot scenes he only wore a hairpiece. The decision was made to use wigs as a time-saving measure, the actor regularly having played both Clark Kent and Superman in the same day. This method was also intended to help maintain continuity between shots, although the change in hairstyles is still apparent in both films. The luminous Kryptonian wardrobe was made from the same 3M reflective sheeting used for the front projection screens, a one-of-a-kind effect discovered in pre-production, the filmmakers having noticed that the material glowed bright when hit by a light source. To maximize this effect, the costume department tore the sheeting into small pieces and essentially pasted together the outfits, each weighing in at 30 pounds and having to be handled with gloved hands to maintain their reflectiveness. To achieve this effect on set, Donner and his team developed specially rigged front projection cameras that sent a light beam to an angled mirror, which then reflected off the costumes and turned them radiant white. While the rest of the cast was dismissed after principal photography, Christopher Reeve was required to stay in costume for almost another year in order to capture the film's numerous visual effects shots, almost all of which featured him front and center. For the film's technical wizardry, Ilya Salkind wanted to emulate the scale and quality of two of 1974's biggest disaster films, The Towering Inferno and Earthquake, and tasked creative supervisor and director of special effects Colin Chilvers with bringing his far-fetched vision into reality. However, the Man of Tomorrow would likely have never achieved a liftoff if it wasn't for the talents of Derek Meddings and Les Bowie, who were responsible for all miniatures and model effects, with Bowie overseeing mats and compositing, and Meddings building and directing the model sequences. And perhaps more critically, the pair was also put in charge of the flying unit during production of the first film. To help realize on-screen flight, they employed optical effects creative supervisor Roy Field, who came with 7 James Bond films under his belt. And lastly, longtime camera operator and cinematographer Dennis Koop stepped in for Jeffrey Unsworth to capture the special effects on film, overseeing his own unit for the optical shots. Meddings was also known for his effects work on the Bond series, and Bowie was an industry veteran with films in the Hammer horror franchise and other genre pictures on his resume. And yes, even 2001: A Space Odyssey, and had just finished uncredited work on Star Wars. Sadly, Superman would also be Bowie's final film credit, the artist having passed away just a month after the first film's release in January 1979 at the age of 65. 3 months ahead of filming, Richard Donner saw a demonstration of the flying effects that had been developed prior to his arrival, which amounted to no more than simple pulley systems and outdated old-school techniques, and so ordered a total relaunch of the flying department. Eventually, several innovative methods were used to send Reeve up, and away, beginning with complex wire riggings for in-studio landings and takeoffs, achieved with the aid of intricate pulleys and counterweights, as well as specialized thin wires which were rotoscoped out in post-production. When on location, a tower crane lifted the actor or stunt performer out of frame, sometimes suspending them as high as 50 feet above the ground. Although Reeve insisted on performing as much of the flying as possible, stunt coordinator Vic Armstrong doubled for the actor when serious risk was involved, and his wife, Wendy Leach, often stood in for Margot Kidder. However, Reeve insisted on taking Superman's first big-screen flight himself, which sees the actor swoop out of the Fortress of Solitude following his time with Jor-El, and was in fact the first flying shot filmed. This pivotal moment followed months of exhausting trial and error, and after Reeve banked past the camera, the entire crew erupted in cheers. Ultimately, Reeve would be credited as the reason the flying effects worked as well as they did, the actor able to balance his body properly on wires and sell the illusion convincingly. At the time, there were no experts in wire work at the level the production hoped to achieve, as it demanded a perfect ballet between actors and crew to pull off, which meant shots were never completed in the first take. The shot of Superman taking off with Lois from her rooftop patio, for example, required over 50 takes to get right. Although the process would be perfected throughout filming, it was never an easy feat, the rigging itself painful to wear and the actors regularly left dangling for hours on end. What's more, the harnesses were said to be cheaply made, and stuntman Paul Weston broke his collarbone when he plummeted 40 feet to the ground after the wires snapped, resulting in a 6-month hiatus. Co-stars Terrence Stamp and Sarah Douglas also did not escape unscathed, with Stamp hurting his leg and Douglas being sliced by one of the wires. Stamp afterward told the press that he thought he was going to break his neck. Actor Jack O'Halloran said that it was obvious safety was not always the #1 concern, and even had to demand padding be placed beneath he and his terrified co-stars, who were sometimes raised 40 feet high. But despite his demands for additional safety measures, O'Halloran suffered a ruptured disc during filming that required back surgery. To achieve Superman and Lois's nighttime flight, and other shots tracking Reeve mid-air, a groundbreaking technique known as the Zoptic effect was created. Developed by optics expert Zoran Perisic, this brilliant method combined the old Hollywood trick of front projection with a kind of motion tracking, having the projector, which put a giant image behind Reeve, zoom in and out in tandem with a specially designed camera, resulting in the illusion that the actor was soaring through the sky. However, this incredible system likely would have never been implemented if Perisic hadn't outright demanded that the Salkinds finance its development. Perisic spent several weeks tweaking the effect before demonstrating it to the producers with a shot of Superman flying around the Statue of Liberty, and Ilya Salkind later said that if they hadn't had the Zoptic effect, they would have had nothing. As aforementioned, blue and black screen technology was used for shots showing Reeve flying at or away from the camera. With the actors suspended between the lens and the screen, the operator would then either zoom in or out, and in some cases dolly in or out, with a special device allowing the cape to flap despite the absence of wind. In the early days of the effect, the footage had to then be photochemically processed in order to remove the blue screen and isolate Reeve. That footage was then inserted into a background plate with a pre-matted area that the actor covered. Because they were making 2 feature films concomitantly, principal photography was originally slated to last 7 to 8 months, a daunting venture by any measure. But just 2 months into filming, Richard Donner was already running weeks behind. As the production progressed, Donner began to fall out of favor with the producers, and what began as minor disagreements snowballed to the point where Donner and Ilya Salkind stopped speaking to one another altogether. Therefore, Pierre Spengler was charged with managing the production schedule, directly monitoring expenses, and handling all interactions with Donner, while Ilya and Alexander focused their efforts on marketing and creative decisions. Alas, peace did not last long, as discord between Donner and Spengler soon gave way, again over the ever-increasing length of filming and the resulting inflated budget, and the director was repeatedly interrogated about his spending and creative decisions. All this despite Donner having never been given a final budget or production schedule of any kind. And so, the filmmakers found themselves at an impasse. The Salkinds believing Donner was a perfectionist who moved unnecessarily slow, while Donner was annoyed by what he perceived as the 30-year-old Spengler's lack of understanding of the filmmaking process. Allegedly, Spengler inserted himself into creative matters, and Donner said that he spent equal time dismantling Spengler's movie as he did making his own. Donner later stated that it became so grim between himself and Spengler that he, quote, would have killed him if he set eyes on him. Inevitably, tensions grew so high that Donner and all 3 producers were no longer on speaking terms, Ilya Salkind having naturally sided with Spengler. To mitigate the situation, in June 1977, Ilya brought in a former colleague as mediator between the warring parties, none other than the 3 and 4 Musketeers director, Richard Lester, who took on the role of associate producer, although he declined to be credited. Reportedly, however, the Salkinds wanted a trusted director on set who could be ready to replace Donner in the event they failed to reconcile. Although Ilya Salkind has claimed that they never planned on ditching Donner, it is on record that the Salkinds attempted to fire Donner over breach of contract as early as mid-shoot. Lester, however, was still an unlikely choice, as he had been in litigation with the Salkinds ever since they failed to properly pay him for both The Three Musketeers and its sequel. The clever producers evaded his legal advances, however, by hopping from country to country until the courts eventually caught up with them. Unfortunately for Lester, his court-ordered compensation was stuck in legal limbo in the Bahamas, and so when the Salkinds offered to repay him in full if he joined the production of Superman, Lester quite literally couldn't say no. Donner, however, seeing the proverbial writing on the wall, made his feelings on the matter clear from the start, telling Lester flat out that he didn't trust him. Nonetheless, Lester reassured the paranoid director that he was only in it for the money, and that he wanted to help Donner in any way he could, and by all accounts, stuck by his word.
Here. Very good. Very good. Thank you, PG. Thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you.
At a certain point, the production simultaneously coordinated 11 separate units and 750 crew members across the globe, accumulating a wildly lavish budget of $55 million, with some sources reporting it as high as $60 million, the equivalent of nearly $300 million today. Because their accounting had all but collapsed, the producers were unable to pay crew members their full salaries, leading to frequent walkouts. And even the company that printed the production's official t-shirts discontinued deliveries due to lack of payment. By September 1977, with the crushing weight of over half a year of filming bearing down on them, Richard Lester was the first to speak up and suggest postponing the second film indefinitely, an idea that resulted in one of the biggest gambles in Hollywood history. Lester suggested putting a stop to anything having to do with the sequel that had not already been expensed, including the construction of sets and anything that didn't involve Gene Hackman and his two cohorts. Left with no other recourse, the producers halted production on Superman 2, and instead refocused all resources on seeing the first film to completion. The sequel's future left to fate. If Part 1 was a box office hit, they would finish Part 2. But if not, the footage would be shelved, even though Donner had already completed as much as 60% of the second film. However, because of this rearrangement, neither of the film's original endings could be used. The first film had been planned to end on a cliffhanger that showed Superman diverting one of Luthor's missiles into space, and its blast accidentally unleashing our trio of Kryptonian villains from the Phantom Zone. This, of course, was repurposed and reshot for the opening of the second film, with Part 2 originally ending with Superman reversing time in order to bring Lois back to life. Thanks to an earlier idea from Mario Puzo, however, the death and resurrection of Lois Lane via time reversal was shuffled to become a key component of the first movie's ending. Frustratingly, the trades would leak the ending of Part 1 ahead of its release, although this information was revealed out of context, with Lois's revival remaining undisclosed, giving watchful fans the impression that the first movie was about to kill off Superman's longtime love interest. This major shakeup ballooned filming to a gargantuan 19-month shooting schedule, and Warner Brothers was called upon to contribute an additional $20 million to the production in exchange for further international distribution and television rights. Filming wouldn't finish until October 1978, just 2 months shy of the first film's release. Although by the summer of 1978 Donner had most of his movie shot and ready for the edit, and despite its wondrous sets and costumes, dazzling visual effects, and legendary cast, Superman was still missing one crucial element: its music. Donner wanted to give the storied character a definitive triumphant anthem, but was torn as to who would bring it to fruition. On the one hand, he had the venerated film and television composer Jerry Goldsmith, who just walked away with an Academy Award for scoring The Omen, and so the director felt a sense of loyalty to the composer. And on the other hand was one of the most celebrated and sought-after film composers of the 1970s, John Williams. Goldsmith and Williams would both be attached at different points in production, but due to its delays, Goldsmith was ultimately forced to abandon the project, at which time John Williams was serendipitously ready and available. Donner later admitted that he wanted Williams all along.
Goodness. The winner is John Williams for Star Wars.
Williams already had 3 Academy Award wins to his name by the time he boarded the production of Superman, having won for Fiddler on the Roof, Jaws, and Star Wars the previous year. And Superman would be his second composition of 1978, having just finished work on Brian De Palma's The Fury. The composer insisted that he wait for a mostly complete film to begin scoring, and therefore the music came very late in the post-production process. Recording took place off and on from July to November 1978 at Anvil Film and Recording Group Incorporated in Denham Bucks, England, with Williams conducting the London Symphony Orchestra and John Georgiadis serving as concertmaster. Once recording finished, music editor Bob Hathaway wove the score into the film. Unusually, the score was recorded and edited 2 reels at a time, which took a collective 2 weeks of studio sessions to complete. For the scenes on Krypton, Ilya Salkind asked Williams to evoke 2001: A Space Odyssey, wanting to musically convey the scope of the film early on. Mostly, however, Williams leaned into its lighthearted and whimsical spirit to create a variety of memorable leitmotifs, as well as what is arguably the most celebrated comic book movie theme of all time. Taking inspiration from such composers as Aaron Copland and Sergei Prokofiev, Williams coalesced a fanfare, march, and love theme that instantly sold the viewer on the grandiosity of what was about to unfold. It was so rousingly received by the filmmakers that the first time Donner heard it performed live, he was so giddy that he interrupted the take to declare Williams a genius. Warner Brothers later released the main title track as a single that climbed to the number 81 spot on the US Billboard Hot 100 chart. Williams would garner yet another Oscar nomination for his contribution, but lost to Giorgio Moroder's score for Alan Parker's Midnight Express. The soundtrack hit stores on December 20th, 1978, to coincide with the film's North American release just a few days earlier, packaged as a 16-track 2-LP set from Warner Brothers Records, also being made available on audio cassette and 8-track.
Can you read my mind?
Oddly, a musical sequence was planned for Superman and Lois's romantic date night flight, with lyricist and frequent John Williams collaborator Leslie Bricusse commissioned with writing the song Can You Read My Mind, intended to be performed by Margot Kidder. However, Donner decided to pull back on the overt musical element and scrapped the idea, instead tasking Williams with writing an orchestrated version of Bricusse's song, whereafter Kidder simply spoke the lyrics in voiceover.
You look at me, quivering.
However, this was not the end of the song's life, as actor and singer Maureen McGovern was hired to lend her voice to what became another hit single from the film in 1979. Can You Read My Mind, reaching number 52 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Christopher Reeve, who had been filming since the summer of 1977, departed the production at the end of September 1978, leaving Donner and editor Stuart Baird with just 10 weeks to deliver a final product. They had shot well over 1 million feet of film. Baird had previously edited Donner's The Omen, and of course would go on to become the director's go-to filmsmith. But he and Donner by no means had a traditional working relationship. The partners' collaboration could best be described as contentious, and screaming matches between the two could often be heard exploding from the editing bay. Baird often spouted that Donner was impossible to work with, and in fact, throughout the editing of Superman, Baird not only quit multiple times, but Donner fired the editor just as often. While Donner was given final cut, Warner Brothers pressed the director to deliver the film in time for a Christmas 1978 release, and Baird said that it was a miracle they were able to finish the film on schedule. As a result of its rushed assemblage, however, the special effects weren't fully developed. and Donner later said that he never found the point at which he was truly satisfied with the picture, and that he would have preferred another 6 months to polish it up. While there was no time for test screenings, some early footage was shown at the 1978 San Diego Comic-Con to a nervous group of hopeful fans, skeptical that Hollywood could ever do right by a comic book hero.
Informing the public is the responsibility of the Daily Planet.
It was Ilya Salkind's idea to open the film on a black and white reel and then expand into a wide theatrical format. And the original plan was to have the opening credits play out over the course of baby Kal-El's journey to Earth. Instead, however, Oxford Scientific Films produced stunning macro photography that acted as the backdrop to one of cinema's most powerful opening title sequences. In 1977, Richard and Robert Greenberg had just founded R. Greenberg Associates, a design and motion graphics effects house, with Richard being the designer and Robert being the producer and camera operator. The brothers stood out from their competitors with their willingness to innovate, and looking to secure their first assignment, the partners didn't hesitate to take a meeting for the design of the Superman teaser trailer. Richard pitched having titles that took on a three-dimensional streaking effect, as if they were flying onto the screen, but in truth, had no idea how they would pull it off. And so, the brothers spent 2 weeks experimenting with different techniques, and eventually settled on a cutting-edge method utilizing a motorized shutter and animation stand in conjunction with traditional slit-scan photography, a process in which long exposure is used to create the illusion of trailing light. Richard Donner was so impressed with the result that he hired the brothers to create the film's opening credits in the same fashion, and they later went on to play a major role in developing the production's many other optical effects. The teaser subsequently won a Clio Award, which honors excellence in marketing and design, and no doubt put R. Greenberg Associates on the map. The trailer debuted just under a year ahead of its premiere, attached to the January 1978 encore release of Star Wars, and featuring music from Jerry Goldsmith's Planet of the Apes soundtrack, announced to the world that a new generation of superhero entertainment was about to take flight.
To find the story, find the right actors for the story, the right director, put all that together. Secondly, you have to find also the finance to make it happen, which is less amusing, but very necessary.
In the weeks leading up to the rollout of Superman the movie, Alexander Salkind was pressured by his investors to resolve his outstanding production debts, and so the crafty producer quickly devised a foolproof plan: extort Warner Brothers. Salkind relayed an ultimatum to the studio in which he demanded another $15 million in exchange for further international distribution rights, and stipulated that if they didn't pay, they wouldn't get their movie. Shockingly, this brazen ploy paid off, and quite bitterly, the studio caved to Salkind's demands. However, in mid-November 1978, just a month shy of the film's unveiling, Alexander's elaborate finagling finally caught up to him when, while in Switzerland, the elusive producer was apprehended by Interpol on embezzlement charges. As was now revealed, it turned out that the senior Salkind had lied, stolen, and cheated his way to the top, and both Superman and his two Musketeer films were partly funded by misappropriated money from a small German movie theater owner named William Foreman, whose business partners had conspired with Salkind to funnel funds to his own business ventures, a scheme which ultimately led to over 20 million in German marks being siphoned. When Foreman learned of his partner's betrayal, he coerced written confessions from them and sued Salkind, who eventually agreed to pay out 25% of his share from Superman. But unbeknownst to Foreman, Salkind knew that this payment wouldn't be made until well after the film's box office receipts were totaled. By the time 1977 rolled around, the theater chain had filed bankruptcy, and Foreman was still sitting empty-handed, at which time he sent the authorities after Salkind. Evidently, the $15 million ransom he received from Warner Brothers was not intended to pay off Foreman, but was instead handed to an even bigger investor, although it has never been revealed who this shadowy figure may have been. Of course, the slippery producer always kept a trick card up his sleeve, and after being nabbed by Interpol, he was able to claim diplomatic immunity and was soon after set free. What the police didn't know was that Salkind happened to be the Costa Rican cultural attaché, and used his seemingly symbolic title to wiggle his way out of the clutches of justice. Despite this ongoing cycle of deceit, the producer would never spend a day behind bars. As aforementioned, Superman the movie would not see a single test screening, and this was primarily due to the Salkind's refusal to release the camera negative to Richard Donner, who had planned to make test prints for US preview audiences before being blocked by the producers. From the beginning, there was a concern that such an old-fashioned character would fail to connect to a cynical post-Watergate America, which was a far cry from the nationalist spirit of the character's earliest readers. And so the question loomed: was Superman still relevant? The producers also grew paranoid over the sudden explosion of superhero TV in the late 1970s, praying that audiences wouldn't forego in theaters what they could get essentially for free in their living rooms. Grasping at straws, it was even considered releasing the film in 3D to give it a literal pop, but this was a risky and impractical alternative that was no sooner discarded. In the end, it was up to the movie-going public to decide their fate.
From a doomed planet in a distant galaxy to a fantastic underground hideaway, from the Fortress of Solitude to the bustling city room of the Daily Planet. Look, up on the screen. It's Superman. Superman, the movie.
Superman the movie made its world premiere on December 10th, 1978 at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., hosting a special presidential screening at a whopping $1,000 per ticket, with President Jimmy Carter in attendance. This grand event acted as a fundraiser for the Special Olympics, and was flooded with celebrities, politicians, and other big donors, ultimately raising almost $200,000. Infamously, however, the night was plagued by absurdities, and when Ilya Salkind arrived on the red carpet, he was greeted with a lawsuit from Mario Puzo, the writer claiming unpaid dues, and the evening slowly devolved into an intoxicated affair, and even Arnold Schwarzenegger showed up to give the Salkinds a ribbing for passing him by. Superman's co-creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster also attended, and were so moved by the film that they were brought to tears. Afterward, the duo sought out Richard Donner to thank him personally, although ironically, they were once vehemently opposed to the film's making. In 1975, following the production's announcement, Siegel and Shuster sued Warner Brothers for copyright ownership, as they had many times in the past, but were again struck down by the courts. Greed was not their motive, however, as the two artists had fallen into dire poverty since selling the rights to their creation for a measly $130 in 1938, with Jerry Siegel now relegated to a nursing home. Ever the fighter, Joe Shuster continued to vocally protest the production, including having sent out a lengthy press release wherein he formally placed a curse on the film. Thankfully, they soon gained an advocate in comic book artist Neil Adams, who took their story to the media and led hardline negotiations with Warner Brothers. His outspoken support eventually led to the pair not only being granted an annual stipend of $20,000, but credit on all future Superman projects as well. Furthermore, the receipts for the first film's box office would grow so far beyond the studio's wildest expectations that Schuster and Siegel were each awarded a $15 million bonus, and their stipend was later increased to $30,000 annually. The same charity event was held in New York the following day at Lowe's Astor Plaza, and again in Boston at the Saks Cinema and in Chicago at the Esquire Theater. It held a European Royal Charity premiere in the UK on December 13th, hosted at the Empire Leicester Square, and this much more buttoned-up affair saw both Prince Andrew and Queen Elizabeth II herself among those in attendance. It went wide in the UK the next day on December 14th, and at the same time made its US West Coast premiere at Mann's Chinese Theater in Los Angeles, also doubling as a charity event for the American Diabetes Association, and had its wide North American debut the day after on December 15th, opening in 501 theaters.
Most of the people here have grown up with Superman, and they want to see how the movies treat him.
Well, Kryptonite, we got to see if Ray Kryptonite really works. Got to see if Lex Luthor is really the villain he's put up to be.
He's probably one of the greatest literary heroes, American heroes, and we got to see if they're going to do justice to the film tonight.
I hope it's not a letdown.
Because of its many delays, Donner and the Salkinds had to take the unusual step of showing the film to select members of the press in its incomplete form, and even went as far as to arrange special group showings in order to get reviews out in time for its release. Generally, the film was a critical darling, with most praising its sets, music, visual effects, and performances, while some took issue with its tonal shifts and front-loaded storytelling. However, Ilya Salkind was eager to experience Superman with a real crowd of unbiased moviegoers, and on a whim, bought a ticket for a New York showing. He later said that the audience's overwhelming reaction allowed him to rediscover the film for himself. Of course, Superman's out-of-the-gate success was in no small thanks to its extraordinary marketing campaign, although its coordinators at first struggled with how to present it to the public. Primarily, they did not want the film to be mistaken for a kids' movie or animated feature, but at the same time hoped to avoid shutting out the younger demographic by leaning too heavily on its serious cast and production values. Advertisement artist Stephen Frankfurt, known for his work on Network, All That Jazz, and Kramer vs. Kramer, was hired to design the film's now iconic 3D title art, which was featured across all print advertising. The font chosen specifically to elicit the fun and kid-friendly nature of the comics, while the steely blue color told grown-ups that it was serious cinema. Although early posters substituted characters for a more abstract approach, the anxious producers chose to switch tactics after the first week of release, and the next wave of promotional material featured Christopher Reeve front and center, as well as highlighting the involvement of Gene Hackman and Marlon Brando, who received top billing. All flying material, on the other hand, would be held at bay until after the film's general release. Superman also likely landed on the covers of more magazines than any film before it, and according to Ilya Salkind, its marketing arguably stirred up more media attention than Gone with the Wind. With a reported $6 to $7 million marketing budget, an almost unparalleled sum for the time, a blitz-style strategy was unleashed by Warner Brothers that saw the studio seemingly tapping into every possible medium on the market, wanting to take full advantage of its Christmas release window.
Tonight's special presentation of Superman is brought to you by Atari, a family of electronic products that challenge you, teach you, touch your life. Discover Atari and discover how far you can go.
Ambitiously, Warner-owned Atari spent a year developing a Superman pinball machine, and 124 units would be distributed across North America in March 1979. Simultaneously, programmer John Dunn was tasked with engineering the first ever comic book hero video game for the Atari 2600, simply titled Superman. The game had the player steer the Man of Steel as he discovered missing bridge pieces, captured Lex Luthor, and returned to the Daily Planet, and featured an enemy helicopter and kryptonite satellite that temporarily drained him of his powers. Released in September 1979, this innovative single-player adventure was a pioneering achievement in home arcade technology, and went on to earn accolades from critics and gamers alike.
Attention Superman fans, Superman glasses are coming to Taco Bell.
That's right, Taco Bell is offering Superman glasses. With exciting scenes from the movie. There's 6 of them. Every time you buy a medium-sized Pepsi-Cola, you can buy a Superman glass.
The studio partnered with Pepsi to give away promotional drinking glasses at Burger King and Taco Bell, also striking deals with Timex and Topps trading cards. And the list of branded merchandise included, but was not limited to, thermoses, calendars, quiz books, puzzles, coloring sets, canvas bags, shower curtains, slippers, lunchboxes, underwear, bubble bath, belt buckles, velour sweaters, pillowcases, a string puppet, children's play suits, and even a Super Hopper pogo stick. The production was also paid $20,000 to feature a box of Cheerios on camera.
From Kenner's Star Wars collection comes the Stormtrooper, the Sand People, and all 20 action figures, including...
Unfortunately, Warner Brothers did not foresee the money printing machine that became the Star Wars toy line, and therefore never bothered to secure any action figure rights for Superman. Mego, which had previously passed on the Star Wars toy rights, then stepped in and produced a series of 12-inch dolls, which unfortunately bore little resemblance to their on-screen counterparts, and failed to take off.
Zod and Lex Luthor each sold separately. It's Superman!
Warner Books published a 1978 inside look titled The Making of Superman the Movie from author David Michael Petro, which took readers deep behind the camera. Petro was a senior member of the production crew and penned the book over the course of filming, and even managed to nab a cameo as the manager of the Smallville football team.
Washed and ready for tomorrow's game, okay?
The Salkinds also later produced a nearly 1-hour behind-the-scenes documentary of the same name, which aired in the US in 1982 and in the UK the following year. Written and directed by Ian Johnston, this rose-colored retrospective was hosted by Christopher Reeve and narrated by Ernie Anderson, and featured extensive set footage and contemporary cast and crew interviews. DC Comics writer Elliot S. Maggin had been trying to get a Superman movie made for several years until in 1974 he was approached by Mario Puzo to guide him in writing a script for the Salkinds. While at the time Maggin was dismayed that his treatment would likely never see the light of day, 4 years later, Warner Books published his completed story as Superman the Last Son of Krypton, which was not a novelization but a companion tale advertised with Christopher Reeve on the cover. Maggin's story retells Superman's origins in much greater detail, and sees the Man of Steel teaming up with none other than Lex Luthor to stop an even greater alien threat. Released the same day as the film's wide US debut, the novel went on to become a New York Times bestseller and gained wide acclaim among fans.
Where am I wearing?
This planner must be made of lead.
Yes it is, so?
Oh, you see, I sort of have a problem seeing through lead.
The producers are hoping Superman will outdraw even the biggest box office hits like Star Wars. Judging from those who've seen it, it's well on its way.
I thought it was great, really. Fantastic movie. See it.
Special effects are great.
Fantastic. Just like a second childhood.
In the US, the film broke several box office records, including Warner Brothers' opening day total at $2.8 million, and three-day weekend total at $7.5 million, and went on to break the 18-day gross record, accumulating $43 million in less than 3 weeks. It became the highest-grossing film ever in nations like Spain, Brazil, and Mexico, and ended up as the 6th highest-grossing film of all time in the US, where it claimed the #1 spot at the box office for 11 consecutive weeks. It has been estimated that as many as 120 million filmgoers saw Superman the movie during its 1978 theatrical run. And in North America, it was the 2nd highest grossing film of that year behind the musical adaptation Grease, and became Warner Bros. Pictures' most successful film they ever distributed. With subsequent re-releases, it raked in a worldwide gross of over $300 million, an estimated 800 prints having been shipped the world over. The film's accomplishments continued into the 1979 award season, where it garnered 3 Academy Award nominations at the 51st annual ceremony, which included Stuart Baird's first nomination for Best Film Editing, a nod for Best Sound, and, as aforementioned, a Best Original Score nomination for John Williams. The film's groundbreaking visual effects were honored with a Special Achievement Award. However, despite Williams losing the Oscar, he was not only nominated at the 36th Golden Globe Awards, but won that year's Grammy for Best Score Soundtrack. In the UK, the film gained further applause at the 32nd Annual BAFTAs, where Christopher Reeve took home the Most Promising Newcomer Award, also seeing nominations for Gene Hackman, Jeffrey Unsworth, and John Barry, as well as another nomination for Best Sound Design. It won the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, and gained yet even more accolades at the 6th Annual Saturn Awards, where Margot Kidder, John Barry, John Williams, and the visual effects team were awarded, in addition to 5 other nominations, capping it all off with a win for Best Science Fiction Film.
A new way to give you television on command. The program you want, when you want it.
On May 15, 1979, Superman the Movie made its small screen launch on both VHS and Betamax from WCI Home Video, priced as high as $100 at certain retailers. In order to meet the cassette's storage limitations, the film was compressed by 16 minutes to a 127-minute runtime, which shortened its credits and sped up any footage absent of dialogue. This didn't seem to deter fans, however, as it went on to earn $140 million in rental revenue alone. Within the initial weeks of the first film's release, it became apparent that the Salkinds' perilous gamble had paid off, and so the fervid producers wasted no time in diving back into production on the film's now hotly anticipated follow-up, which they aimed to premiere just a year later in 1979.
The adventure continues in Superman 2.
However, finishing Superman 2 would be fraught with legal battles, creative clashes, on-set dangers, and tragic losses. A series of events triggered by one fundamental decision that changed the course of movie history.